in Operation Epic Fury, now into day number 10. And he said here during this that it was, quote, an excursion into something that had to be done. He also noted some of the statistics, the details of what has unfolded, saying the United States has struck some 5,000 targets, and they actually have saved targets for later, saying they're going after drone manufacturing. So plenty of questions about that call President Trump had with the Russian leader, Vladimir Putin. As they said, it was a good call. He said he wants to be helpful in relation to what's going on in Ukraine, saying the most help that could be provided was ending that war. He's also talking about the new leader, that the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, replacing him, now the son in charge, saying he's, quote, disappointed by all of this. So lots to get into what we're learning from President Trump. The real first briefing we've had, plenty of questions and answers from the president about this. He said that, quote, Iran had in mind to attack us. That's why they worked first, saying that they were going to take over the Middle East and destroy Israel. Let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox, dive into some more of what was said during this press conference there. Let's bring into the conversation from the Washington Examiner White House correspondent, friend of the program, Christian Datoc. Christian, thank you so much for joining us. And obviously they say that this is pretty much complete, but Hegseth is saying at the beginning, he says it can be both. Where do we stand in actuality there with this Operation Epic Fury?
You know, Andy, I think your guess is as good as mine in this specific regard because, President Trump was asked this during his press conference. How do your comments square with what Pete Hegseth is telling us about the overall timeline of this operation? And the president said, look, I think it can be both. Essentially, the administration is making significant headway on those operational goals for Epic Fury. But we all know that isn't the end of the story in Iran, especially if the administration is invested in seeing a new democratic government stood up in Tehran. So I think this is a little bit of market manipulation, perhaps by the president, trying to calm down some of those stocks and oil futures that we saw run rampant over the weekend. But as far as how long the actual timeline remains, we still don't know.
Yeah, that's so very true. The timeline is so very important because he said it is very much complete, but also was asked, does that mean this week? And he said, no, but very soon. You also mentioned the oil pressures because he said he won't let Iran hold the world hostage in terms of this pressure. How much pressure is on the president right now to bring down some of those oil prices, those gas prices that have been surging the last week plus?
He's facing a tremendous amount of pressure. I mean, let's be honest, gas prices, domestic at the pump, was one of the biggest affordability wins that the Trump White House could hang its hat on heading out of those November elections last year. It's a major step forward heading into this next election cycle. And I do think if prices start floating up to $4 a gallon nationally, that's going to be a major headache, not only for the Trump White House, but Republicans down the ballot in both these Senate and House races. Now, the president does have some significant options at his disposal. He could release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. That's an issue that the other G7 nations have talked about in recent days. He could also go back to the well and simply ask domestic manufacturers to ramp up production. So he certainly isn't without options, but I do think voters are going to be paying attention to this specific issue over the next few weeks and months.
Yeah, we'll see how long it goes. The Strait of Hormuz also asked about the U.S. Navy potentially getting involved in that regard. Also interesting to note that President Trump spoke on the phone with Russian leader Vladimir Putin today, saying it was a good call. What could come of this? Because they're talking about Ukraine, but obviously this is so very tied to what's going on in the Middle East as well. What could be leading from this call? Do we expect anything else?
Well, there's a couple of things here. One, if Iran is not able to send any of its oil out to its two major clients, that's, of course, Russia and China, that would significantly impact Russia's ability to wage war in Ukraine. I think the other big news item that we heard coming out of this call between the two presidents is that President Trump is potentially considering dropping or lessening some of the massive global sanctions on Russian oil production. So again, that could be a major boon for President Putin as this war, stretches on into its fourth year. Now, President Trump was asked about that specifically during his post-speech press conference, and he kind of played it close to the vest. He said, I don't want to, show my cards at this point in time, but it's an issue that he said he was paying close attention to, and that shortly after the operation in Iran winds down, we would see some relief in not only domestic but international gas and oil prices as well.
Yeah, there's only so many levers that can be pulled when this conflict is ongoing. Another facet, and we heard from the White House multiple times, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that a part of the objectives is not regime change. It's taking out the ballistic missiles. It's taking out the Navy. It is limiting those nuclear capabilities. But when asked there about the new leader of the Iranian Republic there, the Islamic Republic, he said he was disappointed. What do we read into that? He says potentially there needs to be a system to help the people, to lead them to peace. What do we make of that? The new leader there not square with who President Trump had in mind.
Well, that system that you alluded to, the president suggested might be helping the Iranian people. We've got it here in the United States. It's called democracy. But the president and other top administration officials have suggested over the past week, standing up democracy in Iran is not one of the operational goals of Epic Fury. Now, when it comes to the younger Khamenei, who was officially named Iran's leader over the weekend, I'm not surprised to hear the president's comments. I mean, it wasn't so long ago, just last week, where he said in an interview that this younger Khamenei is a lightweight and he's an absolutely unacceptable solution to who should lead Iran into the future. So will this younger Khamenei become a target for the United States? The president didn't address that specifically, but I would have to imagine, based on his public comments, that's certainly something that's being kicked around the Pentagon right now.
Do you think that's something that we eventually lead to, regime change? Because obviously we're talking about the IRGC, the system involved with it. They was asked, when is enough that they don't pursue these nuclear capabilities? Is regime change potentially going to be an objective? Is that what we're hearing?
I mean, I don't know if the Trump administration will ever admit that it is an objective, but it clearly is. I mean, if you're paying close attention to this situation, not only what's happening on the ground in between the U.S. and Israeli bombing raids, but also what's coming quite literally out of the president's mouth. We can say in the media and folks outside of the White House that regime change, quote unquote, is not an operational goal. But if the operation results in regime change, can you really split those two hairs? I mean, I think it's a little bit of a semantics battle coming out of this White House and this administration, given how they know how wildly unpopular the 20 years of war that the United States waged in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, let's not forget, President Trump was happy to campaign against, during his first, second, and third attempts at gaining the White House. They know that a regime change war is almost a death sentence for Republicans, not only in November of this coming election, but potentially for Marco Rubio or J.D. Vance or whoever the Republican nominee might be in 2028. So again, they're choosing their words closely, but if you're paying attention to the situation, it should have always been clear that regime change was one of the ultimate goals of this operation.
And how they square those objectives. But I also want to ask you, because Operation Epic Fury in cooperation with the Israelis, how tied at the hip is the United States and Israel, and how have they remained unified throughout 10 days? Are they seeing eye to eye completely on this attack? Because it feels like there might be a little bit of a fracture there between those two allies. How unified are they at this point?
Well, publicly, they are tied at the hip. And we do know, based again on Secretary Rubio's comments, President Trump's comments, that Israel planned to move forward with this bombing campaign against Iran with or without the assistance of the United States, which would almost inevitably result in retaliatory attacks on American military personnel around the Gulf. That being said, if you hear, some whispers coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania, the word on the street is that President Trump and some top White House brass think that Israel's perhaps going a little bit too far in some of these bombing campaigns. I mean, we've seen just the civilian death toll already in Iran. It's one thing to target the command and government leadership structure of the Islamic regime. It's totally different to just wage widespread destruction and death on the citizens of Iran, who, again, let's not forget, President Trump, at the end of last year, leading into January of this year, he was urging them to rise up and topple the government. So I do think ultimately the United States and Israel are united in this war. That being said, President Trump, Bibi Netanyahu, they haven't seen eye to eye 100% on every issue. Let's just look at how the Gaza peace process played out over the past year. But ultimately, the United States and Israel are united in the idea that this regime needs to end and that ultimately the people of Iran need to take back control of their country.
Yeah, and obviously Israel feeling that it was an imminent threat, that President Trump said that Iran felt like they were going to take over the Middle East and destroy Israel. And one of those strikes that is calling into question some of what's going on in Tehran. These are videos, images from over the weekend of a oil facility that was struck there in Iran. You can see the smoke and the flames, and Israel saying that that was a part of potentially military operation, that it was being used. Christian, I also want to ask you, because he was questioned about the girls' school, the elementary school in Iran that was struck, leaving over 100 young kids dead. They said they're investigating it. President Trump has said that it is Iran responsible, the DOD saying they're still investigating. How might that change the complexion of this conflict, whichever way it comes back, whichever way the outcome of that investigation leads?
Well, I think it speaks to that portion I was just mentioning about the civilian death toll in Iran right now. Obviously, no one wants to see innocent lives put in harm's way or ended unceremoniously. But ultimately, this is the calculus that President Trump has to wage behind closed doors. How much of an appetite does the American public have for widespread destruction and death in the Middle East? Again, I don't have an answer to that question. I do want to talk about President Trump's comments writ large, where he suggested that Iran might have potentially gotten a hold of a Tomahawk missile. They were trying to fire it off and it misfired and then landed back down on that school. I mean, I think that just goes to show, one, how early we truly are in this war, and two, how the fog of war is making it incredibly difficult for not only the U.S. intelligence apparatus, but the Israeli intelligence apparatus to try and get a true sense of the land. We don't know the IRGC's operational capacity, either from a troop standpoint or an armament standpoint. So ultimately, again, these are questions that we won't have answers to probably until months or years down the line ultimately. And it's just another tragic sign of how war fundamentally reshapes how the world thinks about this region. And it's a terrible story that we unfortunately have to cover every day now throughout this campaign.
Yeah, and of course, the Department of Defense, Pete Hegseth, saying that the U.S. does not strike civilians, and Central Command also noting that the fact that they are warning Iranians that there might be uses of the Iranian military in densely populated areas. What other questions, Christian, do you have? What other questions do you wish were asked of the president in that moment at that press conference about this ongoing Operation Epic Fury?
Well, President Trump was asked about this, but I do want to hear more about what the plan is for Iran once the fighting actually ends. Will it be to the Iranian people and other Arab Gulf countries to determine how that country moves into the future? The other thing that I think we really need to hear about is what the president's plan for Cuba is. This is something that, again, was raised in the press conference, but based on his comments over the past few days, the comments of Marco Rubio as well, we do know that the Trump administration is eyeing that Caribbean island country. Of course, the Dunroe Doctrine, quote unquote, as we call it, is placing a new focus on the United States' role in policing the Western Hemisphere. But again, I think one thing, a war overseas is one thing for American voters to swallow. But a much harder pill to swallow will be a war in our very own back door. So that's, I think, the top line issue that we need to hear more about as Operation Epic Fury potentially winds down, if you take the president at his word, and he moves his sights to the next theater of combat.
Yeah, this is just the beginning, but as President Trump said, it feels like it's pretty much complete. We'll see which one is actually the truth moving forward. He also said that this is an excursion, that's something that had to be done. All right, Christian Datoc, thank you so much for breaking it all down. Appreciate your time here on Live Now.